February 1900. On the sun-scorched banks of the Mauser River in South Africa, 4,000 of the world's toughest guerrilla fighters are trapped. For months, these Boer commandos, farmers by trade, soldiers by necessity, have been humiliating the mighty British Empire. They've run circles around its armies with expert marksmanship and revolutionary tactics, inflicting a series of shocking defeats that sent tremors through London's corridors of power. But now, their luck has run out. They are surrounded, besieged, and staring down the barrel of annihilation. The British, under new leadership and desperate for a win, can smell blood. Their commander, however, makes a fatal error, ordering a frontal assault that ends in a bloody disaster. A stark reminder of the Boers' deadly skill. This is the story of the brutal, grinding siege that followed. A battle of attrition, desperation, and a final, daring night attack. An attack that wouldn't just decide the fate of the 4,000 men in the riverbed, but would break the will of the Boer republics and change the course of the entire war. This is the story of the Battle of Paardeburg. So how did the British Empire find itself in such a desperate, bloody struggle on the banks of a remote South African river? The Second Boer War, which erupted in October 1899, was a conflict born from a clash of cultures, economies, and imperial ambition. On one side stood the British Empire, the global superpower of the day, determined to control the immense mineral wealth of southern Africa. On the other, two independent Boer republics, the South African Republic, or Transvaal, and the Orange Free State. The Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers, were a hardy, independent people. They were expert horsemen and marksmen, masters of the sprawling, rugged landscape they called the veld. Their society was rural, deeply religious, and fiercely protective of its freedom. When Britain issued an ultimatum that threatened their sovereignty, the Boers chose to fight. They weren't just taking on the world's greatest empire, they were defending their homes. In the first few months of the war, the Boers shocked the world. They weren't a professional army in the European sense. They were a citizen militia, a commando system where men were called up from their farms, bringing their own horses and rifles. They were armed with the latest German-made Mauser rifles, which were vastly superior to the British Lee Metford and Lee Enfield rifles. The Mauser was a magazine-fed, bolt-action rifle with a higher velocity, longer range, and pinpoint accuracy. Firing smokeless powder, it allowed Boer sharpshooters to remain hidden as they picked off British soldiers from incredible distances. Their tactics were just as modern and deadly. They understood the power of trench warfare, camouflage, and mobility, concepts the British Army was tragically slow to grasp. The British, confident in their numbers and industrial might, arrived expecting a quick victory. Their army was professional, but it was trained for set-piece battles in close formation, not for hunting mobile, invisible riflemen on an open plain. The result was a series of catastrophic defeats in a single week in December 1899, a period grimly remembered as Black Week. At the battles of Stormberg, Magersfontein, and Colenso, British generals hurled their infantry in dense formations against well-entrenched Boer positions. It was a slaughter. Thousands of British soldiers were killed or wounded, and the myth of imperial invincibility was shattered. The world watched, stunned, as an army of farmers brought the British Empire to its knees. The humiliation of Black Week forced a dramatic change in London. The government realized this wasn't a minor colonial skirmish. It was a national crisis. Reinforcements poured into South Africa, and more importantly, they sent their most famous soldier to take command. Field Marshal Lord Roberts. A legend of the Victorian era, Roberts was old, but his mind was sharp. He knew the old tactics weren't working. He was joined by his brilliant, if ruthless, chief of staff, Lord Kitchener of Khartoum. Roberts's plan was audacious. Instead of launching more futile frontal attacks, he would use his overwhelming numbers, now commanding nearly 200,000 men, to execute a great flanking march. His objective? Bypass the main Boer defensive lines, relieve the besieged city of Kimberley, and then strike deep into the heart of the Boer republics, aiming for their capitals, Bloemfontein and Pretoria. The key to the entire operation was mobility. Roberts assembled a massive cavalry division under General John French. Their mission was to ride hard and fast around the flank of the main Boer army, commanded by the stubborn and formidable General Piet Cronjé. Cronjé was a veteran of the First Boer War and a deeply respected, if unimaginative, leader. His force of around 5,000 Boers was dug in at Mausersfontein, blocking the direct route to Kimberley. He'd beaten the British there once before and saw no reason why he couldn't do it again. He failed to appreciate the sheer scale of Roberts's new strategy. In early February 1900, Roberts set his great plan in motion. The massive British force began its long, grueling march across the arid plains of the Orange Free State. The logistics were a nightmare. Thousands of ox-drawn wagons struggled to keep up with food, water, and ammunition. The summer sun was relentless, the dust suffocating. But the army pressed on. General French's cavalry division broke through the thin Boer screen and on February 15th galloped into the besieged town of Kimberley, a huge morale boost for the British public. But the main prize wasn't Kimberley. It was Cronjé's army. French's ride had placed him squarely behind Cronjé's position. Suddenly, the Boer general realized his impregnable fortress was about to become a trap. With his supply lines cut and a massive British infantry force closing in, Cronjé had no choice but to abandon his trenches and retreat. What followed was a desperate race. Cronjé's army, burdened by their families and a convoy of over 400 wagons, moved slowly eastward, hoping to reach the safety of Bloemfontein. They formed a column that stretched for miles, a vulnerable, slow-moving target. Lord Roberts, sensing his chance, ordered his forces to pursue and encircle the retreating Boers. The British infantry, exhausted from days of marching on half-rations, were pushed to their limits, with Lord Kitchener driving the columns forward like a whirlwind of energy. The chase was relentless. British mounted infantry harried the Boer column, while French's cavalry swung south to block Cronjé's escape. The decisive moment came at Paardeburg Drift, a crossing on the Mauser River. Cronjé's exhausted column had halted there, believing they had outrun their pursuers. He made a fatal decision. Instead of pushing on and abandoning his wagons, he decided to stop and rest. It was a mistake born of overconfidence, a failure to grasp just how fast and determined the British pursuit really was. On the morning of February 17th, General French's cavalry appeared on the hills to the east, cutting off Cronjé's path. At the same time, the first British infantry units arrived from the west. The trap was sprung. General Piet Cronjé and his entire force of over 4,000 commandos, along with women and children, were cornered. They quickly dug in along the banks of the Mauser River, creating a defensive perimeter known as a laager. The riverbanks provided excellent cover, and the Boers, masters of defensive warfare, turned their camp into a fortress. They were trapped, but they were far from beaten. The stage was set for one of the most brutal battles of the war. With Cronjé's army encircled, the British High Command faced a choice. Lord Roberts, the overall commander, was miles away, having fallen ill. In his absence, operational command fell to his Chief of Staff, Lord Kitchener. Here was a chance to strike a decisive blow and avenge the humiliations of Black Week. The man who had conquered the Sudan wasn't known for his patience. More cautious generals like Thomas Kelly Kenny argued for a different approach. They had learned the hard lessons of Colenso and Magersfontein and knew that a frontal assault against entrenched Boer riflemen was suicide. Their plan was simple: surround the Boer laager, use their overwhelming artillery superiority to bombard them into submission, and wait. Cronjé was trapped. His supplies wouldn't last forever. A siege was inevitable, and its outcome certain. It might take time, but it would save hundreds of British lives. Kitchener would have none of it. He saw the Boer laager not as a fortress to be besieged, but a target to be smashed. He was dismissive of the Boers' fighting ability and believed a swift, overwhelming attack could crush Cronjé's force in a single day. He worried that if he delayed, other Boer commandos would rally and break the encirclement. Victory was in his grasp, and he wanted it now. He overruled his subordinates and ordered a general assault for the next day, Sunday, February 18th. It would go down in history as Bloody Sunday. The British Army preparing to attack was a mix of seasoned regulars, reservists, and colonial volunteers. Among them was the Royal Canadian Regiment of Infantry, who had just arrived after a grueling 5-day march. They were exhausted, hungry, and about to get their baptism of fire in the most brutal way imaginable. The British plan was unimaginative and tragically flawed. It was a series of uncoordinated frontal assaults from multiple directions, with almost no reconnaissance. The artillery bombardment meant to soften up the Boer positions was ineffective, the shells burying themselves harmlessly in the soft riverbanks. As the British infantry advanced across the flat, open veld, they were walking into a perfect killing ground. The Boers waited. Hidden in their trenches, they held their fire until the lines of khaki-clad soldiers were just a few hundred yards away. Then, they unleashed a storm of Mauser rifle fire. The effect was devastating. British formations were scythed down. Officers, still leading from the front, were targeted with chilling precision. Entire companies were pinned down, trapped in the open under a relentless, accurate fire. It was chaos and carnage. The Highland Brigade, decimated at Magersfontein just 2 months earlier, was once again ordered into a frontal charge and was cut to pieces. Other units suffered a similar fate. The attacks were piecemeal, allowing the Boers to shift their fire from one threat to the next. The Royal Canadian Regiment was thrown right into the thick of it. Ordered to advance across a wide, featureless plain, they came under a withering fire. With no cover, they could do little but lie flat and shoot back. The casualties mounted quickly. For hours, they lay pinned down under the blistering sun. It was a horrific introduction to modern warfare. By the end of the day, the Canadians had suffered 81 casualties, including 18 killed, their highest of any single day of the war. By late afternoon, it was clear the attack was a catastrophic failure. The British had suffered more than 1,200 casualties, their worst single-day loss of the war. They had gained no ground, and Cronjé's defenses were intact. Kitchener's gamble had failed, paid for in the blood of his soldiers. Anger swept through the ranks, directed at the high command who had so carelessly thrown their lives away. The confidence that had been building since the start of Roberts's offensive was shattered. When Lord Roberts arrived at Paardeburg on February 19th, He was appalled by the carnage. He immediately cancelled Kitchener's orders for any more assaults. The strategy would revert to the one Kilkenny had argued for from the start: a siege. Roberts ordered his men to dig in, creating a ring of trenches around the laager. He then brought up his heavy artillery, including massive naval guns, and began a systematic, unrelenting bombardment of the Boer position. For the next week, the Battle of Paardeburg became a grinding siege. British guns pounded the laager day and night. The confined space, only about a square mile, became a living hell. The riverbanks that had offered great protection from rifles now concentrated the effect of the bursting shells. The British used new high-explosive lyddite shells, which released poisonous fumes and had a terrifying psychological effect. Conditions inside the Boer laager deteriorated rapidly. The thousands of oxen and horses were killed by the shelling. Their rotting carcasses littered the camp, creating an unbearable stench. The river, their only water source, became polluted with corpses, spreading diseases like typhoid and dysentery. Food and ammunition ran low. The morale of the once invincible commandos began to crack. But Cronjé remained obstinate. He received messages from other Boer leaders, like the legendary Christian de Wet, who promised to stage a breakout. De Wet even managed to capture a strategic hill overlooking the battlefield, but was eventually driven off. Inside the laager, many pleaded with Cronjé to attempt a breakout, but he refused. He would not abandon his wagons. His stubbornness was sealing his army's fate. For the British soldiers in the trenches, life was also grim. They were on short rations, exhausted, and the stench from the laager was nauseating. It had become a test of endurance. But the British had numbers, supplies, and artillery. The Boers had dwindling hope and a stubborn commander. The end was near, but it would take one final decisive action to bring the brutal siege to a close. As the siege dragged on, conditions inside the Boer laager had become apocalyptic. The relentless British bombardment had turned the riverbed into a cratered moonscape of death. The stench of thousands of rotting animal carcasses was overwhelming. Sickness was rampant. Food was nearly gone. Medical facilities were non-existent, and ammunition was perilously low. The commandos were now hollow-eyed, starving men, their spirits shattered by the shelling and their commander's refusal to break out. On the British side, frustration was building. The siege was tying down a huge part of Lord Roberts's army, stalling his grand offensive toward the Boer capital of Bloemfontein. The troops were exhausted and on reduced rations. There was a palpable sense of impatience. They had the enemy trapped, but final victory remained just out of reach. Roberts himself was under pressure. He knew that the longer the siege continued, the greater the chance that Boer commanders like Christian de Wet could mount a successful relief effort. He needed to end this, and fast. The date was February 26, 1900, the eve of a day of great significance for the Boers. Majuba Day. On this day in 1881, a small Boer force had inflicted a humiliating defeat on the British, securing the Transvaal's independence. Roberts, a shrewd psychologist, saw an opportunity. A decisive victory on Majuba Day would be both a military and a profound psychological blow. Defeating the Boers on the anniversary of their greatest triumph would be a powerful symbol of the war's changing tide. The plan for this final action came from a Canadian officer, Lieutenant Colonel William Otter, commander of the Royal Canadian Regiment. His men were still smarting from their heavy losses on Bloody Sunday and were eager to prove themselves. Otter proposed a daring plan: a night attack. Night attacks were notoriously risky. Confusion, friendly fire, and the slightest noise could lead to disaster. But Otter's plan was calculated. Supported by Royal Engineers, the Canadians would advance under cover of darkness, not to overrun the Boer line, but to dig a new trench just 65 yards from the Boer position. From there, they could pour devastating rifle fire into the laager at point-blank range come dawn, making the enemy's forward positions completely untenable. At 2 a.m. on the morning of February 27th, Majuba Day, the attack began. The men of the Royal Canadian Regiment rose silently from their trenches and began their slow, nerve-wracking advance. With bayonets fixed, they moved in stages, forward, then flat on the ground, listening. A small party of Royal Engineers followed with picks and shovels. As they neared the Boer lines, the risk of discovery grew with every yard. Then, a tripwire was triggered. A volley of rifle fire erupted from the darkness. The element of surprise was gone. In the chaos, some Canadian companies launched a premature charge, which faltered under a hail of bullets. It seemed the attack was about to fail. But Colonel Otter and other officers restored order. The main force had not charged. They stuck to the plan. Under heavy fire, they hit the ground and began digging frantically with shovels and bare hands. They were incredibly exposed, just a stone's throw from the world's best marksmen. But they held their ground. For 4 agonizing hours, they dug and fired, creating a foothold deep inside the Boer defenses. As the first light of dawn broke, the genius of the Canadian plan became brutally clear to the Boers. To their horror, they saw a new line of British trenches, manned by determined riflemen, just a short distance from their own. These soldiers could now fire down into the main Boer laager with impunity. Their forward positions were useless, exposed to a devastating crossfire. The psychological impact was immense. The Boers had held out for 10 grueling days, hoping for rescue. This final audacious move broke their spirit. They had been outmaneuvered. The fight was gone. At 6 a.m., a white flag appeared above the Boer trenches. General Piet Cronjé had finally accepted the inevitable. The surrender was a stunning spectacle. From the disease-ridden trenches, the Boer fighters emerged. Ragged, bearded, and exhausted, but still carrying themselves with a quiet dignity. In total, over 4,000 Boer commandos laid down their arms. It was the largest surrender of Boer forces in the war, representing about 10% of their entire military. As they were marched into captivity, some of their recent enemies shared their meager rations with the starving prisoners. The brutal siege of Paardeburg was over. The price was high, but the victory was absolute. The surrender of General Cronjé and his 4,000-strong army at Paardeburg was more than just a military victory. It was a seismic event that sent shockwaves across South Africa and fundamentally altered the course of the war. For the British, Paardeburg was the triumph they desperately needed. After the humiliating defeats of Black Week, the capture of an entire Boer army was a massive boost to morale. It was the first major, unambiguous British success of the war, vindicating Lord Roberts' leadership and restoring faith in the army. The news was met with wild celebrations across the empire. It seemed the tide had finally turned. The battle was also a bloody learning experience. Bloody Sunday reinforced the lesson that frontal assaults against modern rifles were suicide. Conversely, the successful siege showed the devastating power of concentrated artillery. And the crucial role of the Royal Canadian Regiment in the final assault highlighted the value of new tactics and the initiative of colonial troops. The night attack at Paardeburg became a model of planning and execution. For the Boers, the impact was catastrophic. In a single day, they lost nearly 10% of their entire fighting force, a crippling blow. The capture of Cronjé, one of their most respected generals, left a vacuum of leadership. Even more damaging was the shattering of the myth of Boer invincibility. For months, they believed they were militarily and morally superior. Paardeburg destroyed that belief. They had been outmaneuvered and crushed by the sheer weight of British numbers and industrial might. The sight of 4,000 of their finest fighters marched into captivity was a deeply demoralizing spectacle. Strategically, the victory cleared the way for Roberts's advance. With Cronjé's army gone, the main obstacle on the road to Bloemfontein was removed. Just 2 weeks later, on March 13, 1900, Roberts's army marched into the capital of the Orange Free State unopposed. Many in Britain thought the war would be over in weeks. They were wrong. The war was far from over. The fall of the capitals didn't lead to a final surrender. Instead, the conflict transformed. Realizing they could no longer face the British in conventional battles, the Boers melted into the veld. Leaders like Christian de Wet, Louis Botha, and Koos de la Rey organized their commandos into small, highly mobile units that waged a campaign of raids and ambushes against British supply lines. This marked the beginning of a bitter, 2-year guerrilla conflict. It would see the British implement brutal counterinsurgency tactics, including farm burnings and concentration camps for Boer civilians, to deny the commandos support. The war descended into a cycle of attrition and atrocity that would leave deep and lasting scars on South Africa. The legacy of Paardeburg is complex. It was the decisive turning point of the conventional war, where the British Empire finally brought its power to bear. For Canada, it was a nation-building moment. The bravery of the Royal Canadian Regiment earned the young country new respect on the world stage, and the battle is still commemorated by Canadian regiments as Paardeburg Day. But the battle was also a transition. It was a victory won with 19th-century siege tactics and 20th-century firepower. It closed the door on one kind of war only to open it onto another, more modern and arguably more terrible conflict. The white flag that rose over the Boer trenches did not signal the end of the fighting, but rather the end of the beginning. The conventional war was won, but the war to pacify the country was just getting started. The story of Paardeburg is a powerful reminder of how a single battle can change the course of history. If you appreciate these stories from the past, make sure you're subscribed and hit the like button. We also want to hear from you. What other pivotal but often overlooked battles of history should we cover next? Let us know in the comments below. In the history of the British Empire, the Battle of Paardeburg stands as a crucial, if costly, victory. It was the moment where industrial might and overwhelming numbers were finally harnessed to crush a formidable foe. For the Boer republics, it was a national trauma, a defeat that broke not just an army, but the spirit of a nation fighting for its survival. And for Canada, it was a bloody coming of age, a battle that forged a military reputation in the fire and dust of the South African veld. It was the battle that broke the Boers, and in doing so, reshaped an empire and a war.